John Keats's Ode on a Grecian Urn is kind of a companion poem to the Ode to a Nightingale, so we should have some sense of what to expect from this poem. Those two odes are generally seen as Keats's greatest works. They were written during Keats's most prolific period, when he just moved in next door to the girl he was in love with, Fanny Brawne. And this was a particularly creative period for him, in which he was able to explore his signature theme of the relationship between fantasy and reality in a particularly productive way. Like Ode to a Nightingale, the Ode on a Grecian Urn asks about the value of art and about the relationship between art and the real world. The poem's structure in general terms should be fairly familiar to us by now from our reading on the course. The poet reflects on the urn, is drawn into its world, and then returns to his own world in order to make a more general observation about it. So this structure is quite similar to what we've seen with M.H. Abrams' term, the greater romantic lyric, poems in which the speaker begins in a determinate position in nature, reflects on it, is taken on a mental journey of memory and thought, and which then leads to an insight of some kind or a resolution to some moral or emotional dilemma. The poem then returns to the same scene with an altered mood as the speaker learns to see the world differently. So we can very much see that at work in this ode. It is a regular ode. It uses iambic pentameter consistently, but interestingly, the rhyme schemes of each stanza vary, which is something we'll look at in a little bit. Just to go through the poem, looking at stanza 1, this establishes the images of the poem, which are very much the images of the pastoral landscape. Trees, music, lovers, but only in reference to the urn itself, which is referred to as the still unravished bride of quietness and a sylvan historian that tells a flowery tale. And so essentially what we're being presented in this first stanza is a pastoral scene which is painted on a Grecian urn or vase. So this first stanza associates the urn itself with quietness and silence, the foster child of silence. And yet the sounds being conjured up by the urn are described as sounding more sweetly than rhyme. So in this stanza, Keats is focusing on a single sense, that of hearing, and he goes on then to ask a series of questions of the urn. He can see the scene that's depicted on it, but doesn't seem to understand it. And we might ask in this first stanza, why does the urn sound more sweetly expressive than rhyme? This claim carries over to the next stanza in its privileging of the unheard over the heard. In this stanza, the ideal is presented as superior to the real. It caters to the spirit, not to the body. So the figures on the urn don't get to consummate their sensual desires, but this also means that they never lose them as well. Heard melodies are sweet, we are told, but those unheard are sweeter. So at this point, we might start to ask ourselves, is this a convincing argument? At this point, would we rather live in the world of the urn or in our own world? The world of the urn is being made to sound very attractive in the first two stanzas. Stanza 3 rejoices in this eternal quality to the actions. Everything at this point is in process. So this stanza continues to develop the idea that the ideal is superior to the real. The figures, again, the figures don't get to consummate their desires, but they also never lose them. So note the recurrent use of present participles in this stanza: piping, panting, breathing, burning, parching. These are actions that are constant and ongoing and are never completed. So with this stanza, the speaker seems to have entered into a thoroughly sympathetic relation with the urn, or rather with the life depicted on the urn. The subject-object relationship becomes more a sympathetic intersubjective relation. The speaker is engaging with the scene that he sees depicted on the urn. He's no longer just looking at some vase in a museum. He's actually involving himself in that world mentally. With stanza 4, the focus now shifts from the images that are fixed on the urn to that which has no representation at all, whatever is occurring off screen, as it were. What is missing from the representation on the urn? We move away from static representation to the world of imagination. At this point, the viewer of the urn helps to create its meaning, but not all the answers are given. The speaker in this stanza imagines that there must be emptiness somewhere else to compensate for the urn's fullness. Where did all these people come from? If they live in a village somewhere, that village must now be empty. So imagining that starts to shift the speaker's perspective. And in this stanza, we start to see the version of art presented on the urn as something that's potentially harmful, even in that it introduces a negativity into the human world. It's not simply an ideal to be celebrated, as it was. Stanza 5 raises more questions about our apprehension of the world of art. Does it change with the end of the poem? Why, for example, does the speaker refer to the urn now as cold pastoral? Does this imply that something is missing from its representation? Cold, it seems to be a negative judgment, suggesting that warmth and humanity are missing at this point. So maybe the urn is not the ideal. Also, the line "truth is beauty, beauty truth" is the most quoted line from this poem, and one of the most quoted lines from Romantic poetry in general, but not so readily understood. Who is stating this line? Is it simply the urn, or is it the speaker of the poem as well? And who is responsible for the lines immediately following? As your footnote in your textbook explains, the printed version includes quotation marks around "beauty is truth, truth beauty," but Keats's own version of the poem did not seem to include those quotation marks, suggesting that the final two lines may be entirely attributed to the urn, whereas the quotation marks make it seem as if the urn is saying "beauty is truth, truth beauty," and the speaker is adding the following line and a half, which would definitely change the meaning of the poem. The fact that this is what the urn is saying, the fact that art remains in the midst of other woe, is that what you need to know? Or is truth is beauty, beauty truth all you need to know? So as we read this poem, then, we become increasingly aware that we are reading the poem much as the speaker is reading the urn. Just as Keats finds beauty in the urn, we are supposed to find beauty in the poem. But it's a different kind of beauty, one that both presents static images by reproducing those of the urn and models a dynamic relationship to those images. The speaker is describing his own relationship to the urn. So, on the one hand, art offers the possibility of permanence, the version of art represented by the urn, a beauty that endures. On the other hand, does this endurance threaten to become static and stultifying? Is that part of what is going on in this final stanza? So the poem may itself be seen to offer an alternative conception of what art is and should do. So if we contrast the two definitions of art here, we have the urn, which is praised for the enduring quality of its beauty. It offers permanence. Whereas the poem models for us a more dynamic conception of art, an imaginative engagement that breaks through the static qualities of the urn. And one of those dynamic qualities is the rhyme scheme of the poem. Does this introduce a dynamic quality that is what the urn is being shown to lack? So this is a regular ode in that it is in iambic pentameter, but its rhyme scheme is somewhat unusual. The first stanza is A, B, A, B, C, D, E, D, C, E. The second stanza, A, B, A, B, C, D, E, C, E, D. Third and fourth stanzas, A, B, A, B, C, D, E, C, D, E. And then the fifth stanza, A, B, A, B, A, B, C, D, E, D, C, E. So the poem begins and ends with identical stanzas, but goes through a series of variations to reach this point. So is this part of the dynamic quality that the urn might seem to lack? And we should ask ourselves, why would these formal qualities be so significant in a poem about the relationship between permanence and change in art? The dynamism of the poem disrupts our readerly attempt to make it into a static object for contemplation in the way that the urn is. So, does the poem do what it describes the urn as doing, or does it seek to do something else? What does this poem ultimately suggest about the value of art? If beauty is truth and truth beauty, what kind of beauty is truth? And are we really meant to believe that those two things are the same? Or is that part of the message of the urn that the poem itself is inviting us to read critically? So Keats's poem, I'm suggesting, may be engaged in an act of reading and reimagining the urn rather than simply reproducing the kind of beauty that it sees depicted on the urn.